everyone. Thanks for coming to listen to us today. I'm Shane. I'm the surfacing supervisor at Tangent Animation and the film Next Gen.
And I'm Brenna Blackman. I'm a senior surfacing artist at Tangent Animation.
Today we're going to be going over how we implemented a substance-based workflow to create textures for our film Next Gen, how we adapted and improved that workflow, and show some examples of our asset work that we couldn't have done without Painter, and a bit about our methods using Substance and the open source software Blender. Quickly about myself, again, I'm Shane Jackson. I started my career as a visual effects compositor on such films as Dragon Ball Evolution, James Cameron's Avatar, where I worked as a motion graphics designer, Arnold Schwarzenegger's The Last Stand, where I was a 2D lead, Metallica Through the Never, where I was a 2D stereoscopic compositing lead, and I did VFX particle simulation for that too. But after all that, I joined the newly founded Tangent Animation, where we produced the first, maybe the first full-length feature film done entirely in Blender called Aussie. But after Aussie, we made the jump to the higher budget, physically based project we're here to talk about today, Next Gen. Very quickly about that, Next Gen is a co-production between Tangent and Baozo. It's directed by Kevin Adams and Joe Sander, created entirely in Manitoba and Ontario, Canada. It stars John Krasinski, Charlene Yee, David Cross, and Jason Sudeikis. It's the story of an angsty young teen named May who befriends a robot named 7723, and together they do everything from deal with May's personal problems to take on an evil corporation bent on world domination. So let's check out the trailer for that right now.
Welcome to IQ Robotic.
Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready to see the next big thing? Let's hear it for the new Gen 6!
I love you! It's cool. You love robots more than you love me. What's that, honey?
All children must be accompanied by an adult. You're coming with me, young lady.
Nope. Whoa.
Hello. Maybe we could try and be friends.
You're gonna stay here tonight. Not you, Momo.
I knew that. You judging me, bruh?
You being here is like the best thing that happened to me.
Why would you put weapons in a robot?
Something terrible is about to happen.
Holy mother of toast!
7723 is our only hope.
We're floating just to feel alive.
There's way too much injustice in the world. Together, we can fix it.
I promise I got your back. No!
He's so cool. What do you call him? My friend.
Wow! Thank you for opening me. Oh, look out. Here I go closing. Whee!
So, thanks. Everything kind of changed for us when we started Next Gen. We're going fully PBR on this one, and we realized we needed to implement Painter as a big part of that workflow. So with an increased scope and project size, increased complexity of materials, our first challenge was how to deal with this new set of tools, artists of varying skill level in the new softwares, and how to tie that together consistently. Our first step in ensuring consistency was developing a light rig add-on script for Blender that could be easily imported into a work file and removed with the push of a button. That's created by our lighting supervisor at Tangent, Alex Carney, and our CG supervisor, Conrad Durek. This gave the surfacing artists a diagnostic look at how their textures looked in Blender and a perfect baseline to tune their shaders to. Once we got to the point where we were actually rendering shots, we made the call to do all our final rendering with high dynamic range, namely the filmic color management. So increasing the dynamic range of the EXRs we rendered out of lighting gave the artists an incredible amount of control over the final comps and added another level of realism to the final product. Unfortunately, we had started surfacing in an sRGB color space, so we couldn't really change it halfway through for consistency reasons, but we are finished next gen, so we can change that now. And we switched our light rig to filmic and are now more accurately able to build our shaders to suit the look of the filmic LUT used by the lighting department. And because of the fantastic Blender community and a developer named Michael Onders, we were able to load that same viewport LUT that we have in Blender into Substance Painter, so we can ensure our assets look the way we intended them to in Painter from the moment we start blocking out textures to the final comped images you see on Netflix. Here you can see an example of what kind of exposure we get in lighting in an sRGB workflow on the left, and on the right is how that same shader looks rendered in the filmic LUT. The reflections don't get nearly as blown out, and we can push the image around that much further in comp and add those glowing hotspots however we want because we have the range to do so. But back to next gen and sRGB. So with that first light rig, we had a tool to accurately gauge our painter work in Blender. The next step was to consider how we wanted to approach realism and where we wanted to stylize. Since we had determined that we were going pretty cartoony with the shape of a geometry in our film, and that we were going to be rendering in a physically accurate fashion, the choice to approach surfacing was pretty much try to get as real looking as we could at the time. So under the guidance of our brilliant art director, his name is Richard Chen, we started leaning into this tactile, almost stop motion looking effect for our surfacing and lighting. We guided our artists to really think about where wear and tear would naturally happen on these objects in real life, where dirt would naturally gather, how real-world materials like plastic and metal naturally aged. So as we found, we were using all different techniques in Painter and Blender to essentially land at the same desired look. We kind of found a cross-pollination happening between our artists. The Blender artists were learning more about Substance when they saw the results and speed that the people using Painter were getting, and the Painter artists were learning about the techniques the more Blender-heavy artists were using to develop their shader networks. And here is an example of that kind of cross-pollination that ended up in our film. This is one of our sets. It's the factory where the evil Qbot 6 is produced. The challenge here was that we were tasked with creating a tileable material for the walls and pillars of the factory that would have to hold up at any distance, so anywhere from 3 feet to the camera to 100 feet away from the camera. So the first step was just getting a good tileable concrete, something without a lot of contrast, so it could be easily adjusted to whatever scale I wanted, and you wouldn't notice anything like stains or grunge patches, stuff that could easily be seen as repetitious. But yeah, so something like this is easily creatable in Designer, but for this example, I took one off Substance Source. And using Blender's procedural brick texture, I could get the checker pattern you see here on the left and adjust its offsets to look like bricks, or in this case, tiles for the concrete. The neat trick here is that you can use a random generated checker pattern to affect what the image thinks is its vector input. So once that happens, you end up with the result on the right. I can tile my concrete, but it's sort of refracted by the checker pattern here. And the node set up for that in Blender. First, you just unwrap the object like you would anything else, then tile it with the mapping node you see in the second section on the bottom. But the cool thing here is when you separate the XYZ coordinates of the vector and affect its directions by adding the brick data to this. So even before the image knows what its UVs are, they're getting changed by the brick pattern. And that's the final rendered result of that technique. So with a little finessing of the shader using procedural noise within Blender and changing the settings around in a duplicated brick texture node, I could get the mortar or spaces between the slabs of concrete. And I end up with something I can pretty much tile infinitely with no loss of quality or noticeable repetition. Now, when we had started NextGen, we had to split up a bit of the surfacing work between Winnipeg, that's the studio where me and Brenna are based out of, and our other studio in Toronto. So Toronto took the human characters and we did most of the robots. They had hired some very experienced artists who had dealt with texturing human characters for animated films before in PBR. But after NextGen ended and those artists moved on, we were just really anxious to dissect their work and had shifted a lot of that human character work back to Winnipeg. But the day might come where we have to split up the surfacing work between the two studios again. And I wanted to be ready in a case where I'm not physically able to be in the office to help the artists out there. So we decided to make something a bit more ironed out for consistency's sake, something a junior who's never painted human skin can start with. And by doing that, I ended up with a template that could be easily used as a baseline for these newer artists and something that could heavily improve the quality of our generic background characters. So the first step in creating a universal method for surfacing characters at Tangent was creating a base skin smart material. I had boiled down some of the elements from the next-gen skin that was used on May and set up a few additions to that. So yeah, but for now, yeah, we can throw this smart material on an entire body of a character and really just paint a few more masks to get detail into the face. That's kind of what gets the most unique detail here, especially for background characters. So yeah, a new artist just loads this mesh into Painter. They get started by dropping my smart material with paintable mask layers outlined for them as a first step. And for reference, I've outlined the layers I want the newer artist to paint and give them a guide showing them exactly where those layers are intended to go. The artist simply has to repaint the designated masks that I've outlined, and they're starting out their character with a lot of the guesswork taken out and can learn and build off of that example. Yeah, so after we've gone through the outline paint layers, of course, we just add a subsurface scattering mask. For this, I just quickly whipped one up. It's unfortunately not something I can template yet, so it's best just to give our junior artists a reference or example of something that's previously been done. But yeah, because these are a bit case sensitive depending on the character and also considering things like the thickness of their geometry or their body or facial features. It's important to balance the look of the subsurface effect across characters, and it's something our light rig can test for as well. And here's the final result of that templated method. It looks a bit generic here, but can serve as a great jumping off point as a default look. The example is intended for a bit of a background character. This guy still has geometry hair, but the skin is a fairly decent resolution. So if you were anywhere near this close to the camera, of course, you'd get a proper particle hair groom. But now I can get to a point with the skin in hours that used to take us days or weeks. And along with cutting down the time it would take newer artists to get started on skin and faces, I wanted something that would be able to contribute to adding variety to our crowds, background characters, or even just high-res characters we want hanging around this side of a shot. Here I'm using the same texture set for all four heads and getting a wide range of variation, with the exception that I've change the base color map in the two heads in the middle here and keep all the other texture maps, the roughness, height, normals, and color correct it to get the other variations in Blender. The cool thing is about our crowds, this can be procedurally randomized by adding a random value generator plugged into the mix nodes in the Blender material. Yeah, so the two image nodes at the start of the network here are my two base colors that I exported from Painter. That's something I could change within minutes, and adding the two RGB curves for the color variation of the other two heads gets me 4 variations. And anytime I duplicate the geometry that has this shared material, the mixes are randomized and give me any one of the 4 looks, and our crowds get randomized that way. So apart from human characters, some of you may or may not have known, our movie is just pretty much filled with robots. And the most important one, 7723, is the star of our show. Yeah, so he's kind of covered in this 80s style computer plastic on top of a metal skeleton. And he gets horribly damaged and destroyed throughout the course of the movie. So we could kind of illustrate the evolution and the hardship of the character. To do that, we included 13 variations of growing levels of damage and wear into the asset. And we're able to continually update that same asset over months while lighting and animation was happening. The character asset was linked into every shot, so when we updated him, the next day the animator would come into work and open his animation file and have a new switch on his rig to change the look to suit that particular scene without having to import anything or update the file themselves. Yeah, and after he gets hit or scraped or scuffed, it stays there for the entire film. When he first meets May, he's factory clean, but as soon as he rolls off the lot, he starts gathering dirt. And after every fight he gets into, there's some sort of unique damage that he incurs that builds over time. So with a base look and shader network already established, we used Painter to quickly and easily add those variations by exporting just black and white layerable masks that we could plug into those look variation switches. Because he had so many looks at so many points in the movie, he ended up being worked on throughout a large portion of the production. And since the production served as a turning point for us in terms of how we were approaching surfacing, the methods of how we worked on him kind of evolved throughout the film as well. The initial base look was developed with a combination of Photoshop, some Blender texturing, and methods that didn't really involve Substance Painter yet. But the artist who surfaced this, his name was Andy Carney. He actually moved on to supervised modeling at Tangent, and we had to hand the task of one of our first look variations to another artist, which was just sort of a layer of grunge, to a new hire and heavy Substance Painter user. And apart from her beautiful work, her name is Rebecca Harrison, by the way. She did tons of awesome texturing throughout the movie. The most impressive factor was the speed in which we were able to hit that second variation, basically by painting grunge maps in Painter, combining new UV sets efficiently and layering masks on top of the original textures in Blender that Andy did, adding simple black and white texture maps, which were very small in file size. So this way we could keep everything in the rig and switch the look variation with a dial depending on what point in the movie it was. So when we realized how easy it was to iterate these looks and designs for damage with Painter, we were able to afford to include so many look variations into our main character by stacking these black and white masks and edge wear and staining done in Painter into our shader networks in Blender, not interrupting what had already been rendered and not have to change any of the great work Andy had done with the original surfacing. The only time-consuming part was having to learn Painter while keeping up with a production schedule, managing a team, producing assets myself, and learning new software all at once was kind of a lot for me. But luckily, we had just hired a very talented and focused new artist who was one of the biggest advocates of Substance that I know. And she's right here. It's Brenna, and she's going to go over her experience in the project and tell you about how we evolved with Substance.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So, yes, my name is Brenna, and so I'm I guess we've already established I'm a senior artist at Tangent. So for my portion of this, I'm going to continue to talk about our journey using Substance during the production of Next Gen and then to the present. And then I'll briefly take you through my intro to Substance, and then dive into how we used it on Next Gen, what we learned, what we loved, and then talk about how we're using it specifically today on our current projects, with just a little bit of time for some final thoughts, and then do the Q&A. So a bit about me. I got into 3D doing a 2D or a 2-year generalist program for digital media design in Manitoba. So it covered a bunch of things: graphic design, video and motion graphics, web development, and 3D, which is the reason I took it. And during that time, textures were done primarily with Photoshop, Crazy Bump, textures.com, but prior to having scans and that in it. So it was a lot of sourcing images from the internet and making them tileable in Photoshop, or just hand-painted textures. But then in 2015, I took the 3rd year that they have there for 3D computer graphics, all 3D, all the time. And this is where I finally got my hands on Substance Designer. And everything totally changed for me. Inside of a year, I basically forgot that I had been doing textures any other way. Like if I needed something, I could make that something, and it was awesome. They did have Substance Painter licenses at my college at the time, but it wasn't integrated in the curriculum, so I didn't have much hands-on experience with Painter during this time. So after completing the course, I continued with my own work. I subscribed to the indie licenses of Painter and Designer and started trying to teach myself how to use Substance Painter. I would follow other artists who were using those tools, because I really wanted to learn as much as possible about how they were using them, how they were solving problems. And then the stars aligned a bit that summer, and Algorithmic, now Adobe, had their first Substance Days. So this is kind of a full circle moment for me. They held it at the Noman School of Visual Effects, and they were offering master classes in things like Substance Painter from the artists that I was following. So I basically barely hesitated before purchasing a flight and a master class. And this is where I made my first appearance on YouTube. These guys are in the way. I'm basically famous. But it's, more importantly, where I learned some proper Substance Painter techniques in a very short amount of time. Specifically, the thing that changed things for me was learning about the flexibility and power of working with group folders and masks, because I made the mistake at the beginning of using a lot of paint layers, which is fairly destructive. So yeah. By the time I'd started with Tangent in 2017, a few important things had changed. So first of all, that local college that I'd gone to had made the switch to using Substance Painter as their primary tool that they taught for texturing. And Tangent was now in full swing production on Next Gen, and they'd also hired quite a few new artists. So they suddenly had a team full of artists that used Substance Painter and Photoshop almost exclusively, which objectively made a lot of sense. It's arguably more intuitive for artists to onboard onto Substance Painter. I actually remember at that first Substance Days I went to, an artist there had said that he could get an artist new to Substance Painter up and running inside of a day. And at Tangent, we've actually been able to test that theory a little bit, and it's pretty much true. There's a lot of leveling up that you do afterwards, but getting people kind of settled into it is fairly quick. But for myself, I still loved Substance Designer. So lucky for me, there were some designer licenses kicking around the office. Unluckily for Shane, that meant that I was hassling him all the time about what a great tool it was, or hey, this thing we're doing, it would be really great if you use Substance Designer for that. Let's just like start implementing a whole other tool. So why is this relevant? Well, one, I think because I had the opportunity to start with Substance Designer before learning Painter, without the option to skip it, it kind of gave me a unique perspective and appreciation within my team about what it can do. I'd already had an opportunity to get over that hurdle of like, oh, nodes, and just had fallen in love with the program. Substance Painter is a good choice for quick adoption by artists to surface assets. The learning curve is arguably less steep before you can start spitting out really cool stuff. And then with resources like Substance Source, you might feel like you don't need additional material content. So as an artist, it could be very easy to lean the Substance Painter direction and never even bother with Substance Designer. But because my introduction to PBR and the Substance tools had been through Designer, I could see, even if we weren't using it, I could see during the production of NextGen where Substance Designer could fit into our pipeline once we had the time to implement it. And I will just say really quickly that I know that I obviously have a bias and I'm a bit partial to Substance Designer because it taps into some like balance I love between art and like a technical challenge. And I get that that isn't necessarily every artist's cup of tea, but I will and did tell any artist that I worked with that was, I only use Substance Painter, that I think it genuinely makes me a better, using Substance Designer and having some knowledge of that makes me a better Substance Painter user too. But I will get a little bit more into how all this soapboxing about Substance Designer turned out at Tangent a little bit later. So, what does surfacing assets actually look like? The first part is pretty standard. I get a concept I get a concept from a concept artist or the art director. Do my UVing and texture set blockouts in Blender. Start referencing the details in the callout. See what materials I need, what stuff I already have, and then what format is that stuff in. Is it a blend file? Is it a Substance Painter file? Are there polygon maps that somebody was using? We didn't use Substance Source at the time. So aside from whatever we were building ourselves, other assets primarily came from Polygon, which is a photoscans-based database. And then those maps were either layered in materials in Blender, or sometimes we could bring them into Substance Painter and modify them there. At the time, we all pretty much worked how we preferred. The bar would be the same, the time budgets for everything would be the same. But one artist might prefer to build up node networks and do mass painting in Blender's node editor. Another artist, like myself, might prefer to use Substance Painter as much as possible and then put finishing touches and tweaks in Blender's node editor. A lot of this just came down to an artist's individual style of working and their experience with the tools, which is fine. It didn't affect quality, but it did sometimes influence resource sharing down the road between artists that work differently. So on NextGen, this is pretty basic. I predominantly use Substance Painter to surface characters and props. And then I would use Substance Designer if I had time, or maps from Polygon for things like architectural surfaces, walls, floors, that sort of thing. And then just as sort of an aside, I talk about like time permitting, I use Substance Designer. Not everything in Substance Designer has to be super complex. In this case, for the stucco in the downstairs of May's house, I was able to get something that read fairly nicely for the scene with basically a single noise node and some layer adjustments in Designer, and then did additional grunge masks inside of Blender. Speaking of grunge masks, there were other artists that would take all of their architectural pieces into Substance Painter and then use generators to produce their grunge masks. They would bake out those masks and use them in Blender to layer their materials. And this is an example from another one of our artists, Rita Danilov. So for the most part, as with most productions, time budgets were fairly tight. And I didn't have a lot of time to author a lot of complex things in Designer when I'd be given an individual asset. So if I needed a brand new material and could find something in, say, some of our Polygon resources, I would use that. They're quality resources. But if I had the opportunity to use Designer to put something together that I thought might be useful for upcoming tasks, or might help me even modify some of those Polygon maps, or even something that just would make my current life easier with my current task, I would. And I'll get a little bit more into specific examples in just a second. But I will talk about why I obviously preferred using Painter or Designer whenever possible as opposed to using other maps. Well, the first thing that I noticed was that the more an artist used the layering technique in Blender, the larger their node networks would become. And the second drawback was that I found them to be considerably less iterative. And I think these two issues are proportionally related. What if you like a concrete that you have, but you want to add more cracks or more weathering or some specific kind of discoloration? If you're using a scan-based library, your options can be fairly limited. You're restricted to what's available, and then the more you try to individualize those maps, on the Blender side, the larger your node networks become. And that's before you consider state changes that can sometimes double your graph size. So in this case, this was some concrete debris that by the end of the production needed to be burnt and needed to be wet and needed to be driven by some switches. So from an optimization standpoint and even an ease of use standpoint, it's less than ideal. I will caveat that I understand now that Alchemist kind of moots this point a little bit with using scans-based stuff. But anyway, for this reason, our team sort of organically moved towards using Substance more and more as the production continued and moved away from doing a lot of layering inside of Blender. So some specific examples of where the Substance Painter tools really proved to be invaluable was while we were collaborating with artists between Toronto and Winnipeg, specifically when they were like working at the same time as us on assets that needed to look identical. So there was these bully characters that were all wearing the same soccer outfits. And so this is one of them. This is RJ. And he's one of the bullies that I was surfacing in Winnipeg while two others were being done in Toronto at the same time. So to maintain consistency, it was necessary that we shared smart materials for the jerseys and other components to make sure that the colors and our other channels were consistent. And then not only that, but even for myself, when I was done with this character and moving on to the next, I could save out a smart material for the jersey or the shorts or other pieces, drop that into the layer stack of my new character, and my job was that much easier. A lot of it was simply repainting masks, maybe changing the tiling to individualize it for that character. And then here's all the bullies just lined up for our last consistency pass. If for some reason I couldn't get access to another artist's Substance Painter material, or if we were putting them together and we couldn't put our finger on it, but something was looking slightly different, another feature that I use all the time is going into the channel solo modes. So I can take, if I want to be sure that like my roughness values match another asset, I can just take that target map and put it in an app like PureRef, hold it up to the screen, and start making adjustments in real time until things match. And then for certain details like the Eastlake School patch that were on all of the jerseys, I found it useful to create a tool preset. So the maps for this patch had been made by another artist already, so I just formatted them in Photoshop, made sure everything was in the same place, was the same size, and then I brought them into Substance Painter as textures, put them in their respective slots, and saved that tool out to my shelf, and now I have a patch tool, and if I received any revision notes for that patch and needed to be smaller or move somewhere else on the jersey, I just had to stamp it again in a new paint layer. And then more importantly, adding it to any other characters now takes like a matter of seconds. So sometimes you get one of those assets, it's like not super important, but you love working on it, and this helmet was one of them. It's in the movie for like a second, but it's one of my favorite things that I got to work on. It's get to do a little bit of painting, and I also got to do a little bit of substance designer. So in the case of this helmet, there were a bunch of stickers that had to go around the helmet, and the designs were, again, supplied by our concept department. And I could have just imported the stickers into Substance Painter with their alphas and loaded them into my brush every time I wanted to use one. But switching back and forth between different stickers would have been a total pain. So, because I assumed there would be potential that I might have to stamp these things more than once and flip between them, maybe make edits for myself, or like go to the art director and he's like, I hate where all of these are, please put them in these different places. I decided to make myself a tool in Substance Designer. So I loaded up all the stickers and all their alphas into a couple of switch nodes, expose one parameter so that I can flip between them, and I'm done. Now I can play with stickers forever. So just to recap, some of the benefits, the major benefits that we noticed while using Substance on NextGen almost right away was that iteration was super fast and also fairly non-destructive. And then, importantly, sharing assets was relatively pain-free. If an artist needed a material I'm working with, even while I'm in progress with something, I can just pack up a section that they need into a smart material, and then they can drop that into their layer stack, repaint some masks, adjust some of the tiling amounts, and then also a really awesome aspect of using Substance Painter now is seams are what are seams. Between like projection painting and triplanar, you don't really have to worry about that anymore. So, as Shane and I have mentioned, using Substance during NextGen was a real-time use case scenario. We were learning how to use the Substance toolset and where it fit into our pipeline as we went. By the end of NextGen's production, we had a good idea of what we wanted to do with Substance and saw how leaning harder on those tools would really benefit our next production. And thankfully, we had some time to R&D these things between our projects. And most importantly, my dreams came true, and we since added Substance Designer to our surfacing pipeline in earnest. So during the pre-production stage of our newest project, a handful of our team had become familiar with the software. And then using our style guide for our newest project, our artists have been able to build up a material library specific to the style of the world that we're building. We also use Substance Source now, which has been incredibly beneficial, not only in sort of like a material development side of things, but it's a library that's easy to share with other members of our team, like a lead or a supervisor or an art director, to discuss materials. If we're looking for a specific kind of metal or something like that, we can start browsing through that library, get ideas, and find benchmarks for the type of thing that we're looking for. And having access to like the substance graphs means that Shane can send me or another artist familiar with Designer a link and say, hey, I really like this wood, or I really like this dirt, but do you think you could make a version that has larger stones or bigger roots or something like this, but that has a way more graphic art style? The point is that we now have endless flexibility to create what we need to for the unique worlds we're bringing to life. And then to bridge the gap for some of our other artists, we also use Substance Player. So for the artists that aren't familiar with Designer but still want to play with and bake out tileable maps, they can use Substance Player to modify exposed parameters and then bake out the maps that they need. Using all of these things, it just means that we're avoiding all of those huge node networks that I was showing before in Blender. Another great thing is that this time around, we have created our specific shells for our projects. So once we've developed and collected all the materials that we need, they'll live in a directory on the server that everyone can access, shared on a shelf amongst the team that automatically updates for every artist. So we don't have to, it doesn't matter. Now that we're all mostly using Substance, there isn't that problem of sharing resources between people who work differently. And I don't have to drop something over Skype or through email. They can find everything that they need on the shelf. Smart materials, tools, brushes, all those things are put on the shelf for consistency, but each artist keeps their own default library, so we aren't sharing every iteration of a new mask or brush that we develop while we're working. So the non-destructive workflow and instant visualization in both Substance Painter and Designer enables quick iteration of ideas and fast turnarounds on making adjustments, which is very important on a tight deadline. And then supplementary resources like Substance Source let your art department get hyper-specific with their needs. And then ultimately, you can play with more ideas to get the best results without adding an unreasonable amount of time. And at the risk of saying this too many times, if you can afford the time investment, and if you're already using Substance Painter, look into using Substance Designer. Why search around for material assets when you can make those assets? Or why limit yourself to scans when you can use procedural, flexible materials that you can curate to exactly fit whatever your needs are? But beyond creating material libraries or modifying existing materials, if you are a Substance Painter user and you want to make a cool filter or a cool brush or mask or tool, whatever, sounds like you want to learn a little bit of Substance Designer. And yes, a lot of this is time investment up front. So for a lot of us, the knee-jerk reaction is that you don't have time for it. But with good forward planning, creating these material libraries and tools for yourself truly pays off. It might not seem like it at the beginning, but at the end, you're going to save yourself so much time. So we found that using all these tools has really helped unify our surfacing team while simultaneously giving us more freedom and flexibility. We can iterate on ideas faster, exchange material faster, which makes collaborating across cities much more consistent and painless, which leaves us more time to create, have a little fun, and just focus on making cool stuff.
And also, we're hiring, so if you want to come move to Canada and work at Tangent Animation, you can come find us. Or go to the website there, and we have lots of job postings.
And then before we get into the Q&A, I just wanted to say thank you to Adobe and Substance Days for having us here today. It's been awesome.
Yeah, and we'd love to answer any questions if you have any.